All right, this video relates to the opening movie that we're going to watch in this business ethics class. So the movie is Thank You for Smoking. It is a satire, so it's meant to be very ironic. It's meant to be funny, and it's meant to be funny and ironic in a way that highlights problems and issues and brings our attention to them, not by kind of lecturing or not by saying this is evil, but by being funny in a very kind of witty way about it. So the issue here, as the title suggests, is smoking. And what we have is Nick Naylor, who is essentially a spokesperson for the tobacco industry. And the movie describes his journey as the spokesperson, his rise to prominence, his fall from grace, and ultimately his reemergence and his final victory. All right, so what I think is really kind of valuable about this movie is not only kind of what insights we might gain about business ethics, about a certain vision of business, I might say that, but it's also a really, really powerful movie in terms of arguments and how arguments can be used. And ultimately, I want to say that the way that arguments are used in this movie is incorrect, or it's one way that I don't think is ultimately the best vision of what it means to make an argument. Okay, so we open here with the idea. It opens up with a talk show, and he's there with some people that are criticizing smoking, and there's a kid with cancer and the shaved head, and the audience is against him. Everybody hates him, and that's kind of the opening scene here. And what we find in this very opening scene, and this is repeated continuously throughout the movie, is the instrumental nature of his job. And so what does instrumental means? What does that mean? It means that his job and what he says is a means to an end. In other words, the end is important, not how he gets there. And so when it comes to argument, he essentially, we could look at it as saying arguments can be used for whatever end that you desire. If you are good at making arguments, you can rationalize, you can justify anything. You can turn something evil, or seemingly evil, into something good, or at least acceptable. And so, certainly, that's the first thing I want you to think about. Is that the nature of what an argument is? Is that the purpose of an argument? It certainly is one purpose, but is it the only purpose, and is it the highest purpose? We could also ask, is the message of this movie that everything is instrumental, that everything is a means to an end, does that describe business accurately? When you're in business, is the only thing that's important, is it making money? Will you sell whatever, will you say whatever it takes to make yourself profit? If it is, then business for you is a purely instrumental enterprise. The only thing that matters is the end, is the profit, is the money. How you get there, what you sell to get there, what you tell people to get there is ultimately unimportant. And certainly that is the position that Nick Naylor occupies at the outset of this movie. And again, it's a satire, so that it's very kind of funny in the way that it does it. We see again this instrumental nature of argumentation when he's in the school, and it's bring your dad to work day, and people have to talk about their careers, and he says he speaks for the tobacco companies, and the girl is like, well, my mommy says tobacco is bad, cigarettes are bad, and he says, well, is your mommy a doctor? Is she a scientific researcher? Not exactly credible, eh? And so there, what the argument is doing, again, he's not trying to say that cigarettes are good, but he's just trying to discredit certain sources. And what I think is really interesting in this scene, and again, this occurs at numerous points throughout the movie, is that he talks about something good, or at least potentially good. He talks about questioning authority, about not simply accepting something because it has been told to you, about using your critical reason. And so that's how he justifies his argument to these grade schoolers. He says, well, should you always trust what your parents tell you? And in one sense, that ability to question, That ability to think outside the box, that ability to think for yourself is certainly a good thing, many would argue. But we can ask, is this his objective? Does he really want to create people that think better, that think more independently? Or is that explicit aim not really the purpose at all? Is he just using that as a way to cast doubt on his opponents and therefore potentially get more people in the future, more kids in the future to smoke? Okay, the Mod Squad, so Merchants of Death, it's him and his buddies, from the firearms industry, from the alcohol industry, and again, some very kind of comedic scenes there. But we can ask, the way they talk about their industries, the way they defend their industries, do we need to look at those defending industries such as these in this way? Do we need to look at them very cynically? Do we need to look at them as disingenuous, as not really meaning what they're saying? And by the same token, we're thinking about arguments are the only way that people can defend these industries on these kind of purely rhetorical arguments that are not based in truth. And that's, I think, one of the really critical questions here. Certainly the movie, through Nick Naylor, portrays arguments as nothing but a way to persuade people to accept your point of view. Or if not persuade them, at least discredit your opponent. So it doesn't really matter what the truth is. It doesn't matter if there is truth. The point of an argument is simply to persuade people. Now, I would want to say that certainly in the philosophic tradition, that argument is meant for much more than that. That is insufficient, that is a deficient view of arguments. For philosophy, for intellectual pursuits generally, for theology, just for all of the kind of great subjects of human history, the point of arguments has been to get to the truth. And actually, we see this kind of debate in Socrates, one of the very first philosophers, the first prominent philosophers. And one of his biggest debates is always between him and the sophists. And the sophists are like Nick Naylor. Essentially, their job, they get money by telling people how to argue their point. They don't care whether the person is right or wrong. They don't care whether the argument is true or false. They just tell people how to argue and tell people how to persuade people to get them to accept their point of view. And so that's Nick Naylor. He'll do anything to persuade you to accept his point of view, or again, to discredit his opponents. Whereas the Socratic, the philosophic tradition is saying no, that the point of argument, that the only valid argument, that the only genuine, authentic argument is one that seeks the truth. And so that is not what is happening in this movie. And so we can either say, well, what this movie describes is just the nature of business and the nature of the way people use arguments, and that the desire for truth and the argument that seeks truth is just kind of a romantic vision held by a few. Or we might say that what is portrayed in this movie, in terms of making arguments and in terms of the way it portrays business, is a mischaracterization. That in fact, most people use arguments and pursue arguments, and most people pursue business, arguments for the sake of truth, business for the sake of well-being and good. And so that's one of the central themes of this course. What is it to be a good business person? Is it simply to persuade people to buy your product, or is it to contribute to their well-being? Okay, so a number of other points I want to mention here. The kid, it's interesting, he convinces his mother to let him go to California. There, again, he takes after his father. The point of arguments is simply to get your way, to get your point of view. The interview with the Hollywood guy, what's his name? Rob Lowe. Again, very kind of funny guy, funny scene. But again, you see this use of argument simply to justify the position that he wants to come to. And Rob Lowe simply wants to get the cigarette company's money and wants to use that money to produce a film. He doesn't care what message is being sent out, but he's able to justify it through arguments. And so he's able to distance himself from the moral consequences of his position. And so he says, well, who am I to decide? The people should decide whether smoking is good or bad, not me. And then later on in the movie, again, this call from Jeff. He's talking about that they're going to produce this movie with the Sultan from Bahrain, who is also a tyrant and kills people. And he says, look, my dealings with him, he's always been a pleasant guy, nice guy to deal with. I don't know about any of that other stuff. And so here he's using argument to rationalize his decisions and to distance himself from morality. In other words, that character is completely amoral, and some might say immoral. Morality, the rightness or wrongness of his decisions, the rightness or wrongness of the projects that he's pursuing is completely secondary. It's completely unimportant. And he's able to make that unimportant through his use of argument. And so in this way, argument can create a gap, can create a separation, can allow you to distance yourself from the morality and the consequences of your decision. And that's something we're going to also explore a little bit later in the course with regard to a divided self. But again, we can ask, is that the point of argument? Is it to create a separation between our decisions and the moral consequences of those decisions? Or should an argument highlight, illuminate, bring our attention to the moral issues that occur when we make our decisions? A couple other points I want to mention. He talks to his son. The arguments are put in the service of nothing other than one objectives. And he says here that, look, everybody needs a defense. If you're charged with a crime, there's a defense lawyer, and his purpose or her purpose is to defend you no matter what you did. And he says, look, everybody needs somebody to defend them, including corporations, and including these corporations that are seen as evil. And so that's one way that he justifies to himself, Nick Naylor, his campaign and his spokesperson role for the tobacco company. And you can ask yourself, well, is that sufficient? Does he really believe it? And would that work for you? Is that a reason to defend these companies? The purely instrumental nature of this movie, or a people, of business, is also evident in the reporter, right? So the reporter, Katie Holmes, sleeps with him to get information for her story. And essentially she uses herself, she uses her body, and she uses Nick Naylor simply to get a scoop, simply to get a big headline story. And again, the theme here is that people, jobs, business is purely instrumental, purely a means to an end. Do whatever it takes to reach your objective. And that's one way of viewing business, but it's not the only way, and it's certainly something we'll question. What I want to end with is the congressional hearing. And in that congressional hearing, Nick Naylor defends cigarettes on a number of grounds. And it's interesting to think about whether you agree or disagree with these arguments. Certainly, they're important arguments to take up. And he says, look, do people need to be warned about cigarettes? They already know that they're dangerous. Why do people need a warning? Why do people need a visual clue? So ask yourself, do you agree or disagree with that? Should we warn people about products that are dangerous? Should we warn people about products which we know, or which the vast majority of people know are dangerous? Is that simply redundant? Is that fair? He also argues that deaths occur from all kinds of other products, from car crashes, from plane crashes, from people eating poorly, and that's where he attacks the Vermont senator for the cheese, by clogging our arteries. And he says, look, there's all these companies all the time whose products lead to death. So why single out the cigarettes? Why make them, why demonize them? And so again, I wonder if you kind of agree with that position. One thing that I thought of, and I would have loved to kind of ask Nick Naylor in this fictionalized movie, is we require people to get a license before driving a car because we recognize as a society that it's dangerous, that you should know something about what you're doing before you drive your car. Should we do that with cigarettes? It's an issue we're going to take up near the end of the course with this idea of autonomy. How much autonomy, how much freedom should a customer be given to choose the product that he or she wishes? Finally, he says, look, that the warning, that the communication about the danger of the product should come from the parents. That's who should warn people. That's who should warn kids. It's not the responsibility of society. It's not the responsibility of cigarette companies. It's the responsibility of parents. They're the ones that help their child understand what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what is dangerous, what is healthy. And so I wonder if you agree with that. Should it be the parents? Should it solely be the parents? Should we mandate warnings and safety procedures above and beyond what parents would provide. Okay, so again, think about this movie. It's a kind of interesting introduction to business, to creating arguments, so it works on both levels. And with that, I look forward to your responses.